Welcome to the real world, millennials. World of hope, promise, optimism, and crushing debt from student loans and a real concern over what your future will be. For those scratching their heads yet with another catchphrase to roll about, we'll fill you in here. Millennials have no real precise calendar dates, but are generally considered those born between the early 80s to the early 00s. I don't qualify. They are the ones now wondering not only where their American dream is, but if it is even attainable right now. Welcome to Midpoint from Generation Opportunity, a website aimed at millennials and confronting them with some of the hard truths about life as they will know it. Corie Whalen Stevens joins us today on Midpoint. Corie, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I'm going to get off to student loans here in just a minute, but let's get right to this because you have a group of people. I take it that you are also in the millennial group, correct?
Yes, I was born in 1987.
Okay, so there are still millennials sitting out there who are wondering, wait a minute, where's the American dream for me? So let's start right there. Is there still an American dream for the millennials, or are they going to have to work twice as hard and wait 10 times as long as we did people born in the 60s and the 70s?
I think there is still an American dream for millennials, but you're right that the times are tougher now. And what we at Generation Opportunity, we're trying to draw attention to the fact that millennials actually are a very creative entrepreneurial generation. Unfortunately, a lot of the government's policies have really amounted to a war on youth, and that's what we need to fight in order to attain that American dream.
All right, now here comes something else. We've always heard the war on women. We hear a lot of these war on phrases. So now I'm going to ask you to detail this now. You say a war on youth. Specifically now, give me those 1, 2, or 3 things that really say to you that it's absolutely against the youth of America.
Sure. Well, there's a lot of policies coming down from Washington that really embody this. First of all, as you mentioned, student loans, and I know we're going to get into that. Also, just the general pervasive generational theft in government policy, whether you look at our bankrupt entitlement programs that won't be there for my generation without reform, whether you look at them piling on with more national debt, 17 trillion, not to mention 120 trillion in unfunded liabilities on top of that, then you have Obamacare that targets my generation with more debt.
I hate to say this, but I'm going to ask about some millennials right now who, when you talk about crushing debt, and you're right, let's not downplay that in any sense, but there's some millennials right now who have no idea what the crushing debt is. They have no idea what the realities of the economic situation is today. So isn't it a little bit, I hate to say this, but here we go, a little bit their fault for not knowing what they're facing and being prepared for it?
Well, you're not wrong that there's a lot of people who don't realize what the problems are. Part of that is, frankly, my generation's not taught that in our school, which is an entirely different topic of discussion. But that's what we're trying to remedy at Generation Opportunity. We find that once we educate our peers on the immensity of these problems, you do start to see an understanding and willingness to take action, but you do have to reach them first. I agree.
Okay, educate them right now here. The first thing that these millennials have to know if they're going to succeed. One thing.
One thing, well, I would say to be aware of the fact that the government is not on our side with their policies, and that really maybe they should educate themselves in their voting patterns and try to look at the politicians that will rid of that generational theft. Also, of course, in their personal lives, personal responsibility and smart financial decisions.
Wait a minute now. Smart financial decisions. Hang on just a second here. I don't know, but for a lot of people in their 20s, smart financial decisions, those are words that we never quite knew. So isn't it also fair to say that you still have a generation, your generation, and I'm not going to generalize everybody here, but there are a good number of them who have no clue what smart financial decisions are, even to this day?
Well, yes, that's true. And I think that that's also, always been true of young people to an extent, that maybe they graduate college, they come into the real world, and, there is an adjustment period. But overall, yes, young people need to be educated on that. And frankly, part of the problem is when it comes to issues like student loans, I think that high schools and colleges need to do a better job of educating on those aspects of the problem.
All right, let's go ahead and talk about student loans here, because I want to bring you up and this is, I believe this is from your website as well, where it talks about, and I'm going to quote, facing sluggish approval ratings and pressure from the left and right to offer a solution to skyrocketing tuition costs, President Obama instead announced a plan that only panders to a demographic whose support for him has dropped to historic lows. Okay, let's get to that now. Panders to a demographic. Support has dropped to historic lows. From some sort of relief, though, on student loans, isn't something needed? Because I know people in their 40s who still have a tremendous amount of debt sitting there. So isn't some sort of relief desperately needed?
You are absolutely right that some sort of relief is needed. The problem with the president's plan is that it's simply a subsidy that masks the problem. It's kind of like Obamacare in that sense. Obamacare is not lowering costs, but they put a taxpayer subsidy on the table and say, hey, the problem is fixed. Well, it's really not. The issue is historically, student loans, the more and more federal intervention has become present in this loan market, you're seeing the cost increase by a huge amount, much, much higher than inflation. And so at Generation Opportunity, we support reforms such as the HERO Act, which would actually allow for states and local schools to actually change some of their accreditation processes and actually be able to innovate in this market and bring costs down and empower students as consumers, rather than masking this with more and more federal debt that frankly is going to end up on my generation's plate at the end of the day anyway.
When you talk about bringing costs down, isn't it fair to say that there are a lot of universities and higher education levels out there that, simply put, are constantly rising costs? It is difficult to get into some of these institutions anymore because without a student loan, if you're 18, 19, 20, early 20s, without that student loan, you can't in many cases get into a better school. Is that fair?
It is fair. And when we address this problem, we have to look at what the root cause of that is. Now, I completely understand the moral aspect of wanting to basically nationalize the student loan industry, and the federal government said we want everyone to have access to an education. Well, the incentives that created for the colleges and universities was to keep rising prices up and up and up. And frankly, some of these professors, the amount of money that they're making is reflective of this problem. And so the universities have no incentive to compete and keep costs down when the student loan spigot is infinitely available.
Okay, so then how do we make them incentivize themselves? How do we get them to compete in order to lower costs? Because remember now, what you're talking about sooner or later is a university president somewhere or teachers taking less money. You're talking about NCAA issues in here as well. You're talking about the big athletic programs are going to have to take less money. You're asking people to take less money, which in any sense of the imagination is the toughest thing to do.
It is the toughest thing to do, and that's part of the problem. That's why we specifically do support at Generation Opportunity some of the reforms in the HERO Act, because look, I recognize you're not going to get the federal government out of the student loan industry. That's not realistic, but there are some things that can be done if the federal government would just take a little bit of its grasp off of this industry and devolve some of that power back to states, allow them to change the accreditation process, allow for more innovation in this industry, such as maybe more online universities, things that really allow students to diversify their education rather than it just being this traditional top-down model.
If they are given the right to do it and the chance to do it, though, would the states take advantage of it? Because again, you're sort of, boy, I hate this phrase terribly, this kicking the can down the road phrase. I've heard it way too much in the last few years. But aren't you basically just kicking it to somebody else and letting somebody else see if they can solve it?
Well, the thing is that that's frankly how the free market works. And it's tough because there's no one-size-fits-all solution. One of the problems is there's been such a centralized stranglehold on this industry that there's been no bottom-up innovation. And so when you let some of that power go, there is no guarantee that there will be 100% success. But it's sort of the same idea behind federalism in this country, where states are the laboratories of innovation. We have to allow that because this top-down model clearly is not working, and subsidies to mask the rising costs are not going to solve this problem ultimately.
You mentioned on Generation Opportunity supporting meaningful proposals that deal with the root cause of higher tuition costs. You mentioned Senator Mike Lee, Representative Ron DeSantis, higher education reform, the HERO Act. So outside of the HERO Act, though, is that the basic core of what you're talking about, or is there something else involved here that needs to happen in your opinion?
Well, in terms of legislation that's currently on the table, the HERO Act is certainly what we are at this time supporting. But in general, colleges and universities, the more that we can take some of this power out of these centralized entities and allow for innovation and competition, the lower the costs will go. Because right now, students are not empowered as consumers. They are basically filtered into this system where they're forced into student loans, like you said. So the more that we can allow for that bottom-up innovation and actually make students in a position where they're competing within this system rather than just being filtered in through one direction, I think we'll see some more success. And there's no guarantee whatsoever, but that's what a market is for, to create that competition.
Corie, about the minute or so that I have left here, here's one of those things that I'm going to have to throw in here from a guy over 30, which I certainly am at this point. But you certainly have a generation who says, Wait a minute, these millennials have been handed everything. They have an ability for education. They're not going out there, they're not working hard, they're not trying to do whatever they can to find a job. Damn them, they're just a bunch of lazy kids who want it all handed to them. I would suppose that you probably have an answer for that.
Well, I don't think that that's fair to say, because as we started this conversation surrounding, it's true that millennials are being faced with really a disadvantage in terms of our economic prospects. So you could say, sure, we were raised to have an entitlement mentality, but frankly, that's not really entirely true when you see what we're now faced with. And the fact that as millennials, we're still being asked by our government to subsidize older and frankly wealthier generations. If you want to talk about an income gap, the income gap is generational and it's pervasive.
How dare you think that you're going to take care of us in our old age? How dare you even say that and counter the argument? My goodness, you've set everybody off now. You've made common sense here, which is frightening. Please don't ever do that again. Corie, thank you so much for being with us again. It is something that we are going to watch because what's happening, and I know a lot of people who are still buried in their debt, and again, they're in their 30s and their 40s. Here's hoping that Washington does indeed do the right thing to take care of it. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
All right. There you go, guys. I figured I had to bring it into us older guys as well. Hey, don't forget social media. If you want to go ahead and get a hold of us here at Newsmax, make sure you drop us a line. During the day here, we'll drop you those notes on how you can get a hold of us, both in email, Twitter, and on Facebook. Wait till I start getting on Facebook. Midpoint continues.